Preface to The Gentle Art of Faking. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. The Gentle Art of Faking. A History of the Methods of Producing Imitations and Spurious Works of Art from the Earliest Times up to the Present Day, by Riccardo Nobili. Preface. Le dernier mot de l'art, je le trouve dans la contrefaçon. Sainte-Beuve. To Mrs. Mary S. Shepherd, with the devoted affection of a son, this book is dedicated. Collectomania may with some reason be looked upon as a comedy in which the leading parts are taken by the collector, the dealer and the faker, supported by minor but not less interesting characters such as imitators, restorers, middlemen, et hoc genus omni, each of whom could tell more than one attractive tale. In analysing the faker one must dissociate him from the common forger. His semi-artistic vocation places him quite apart from the ordinary counterfeiter. He must be studied amid his proper surroundings and with the correct local colouring, so to speak, and his critic may perchance find some slight modicum of excuse for him. Beside him stands the imitator, from whom the faker often originates, the tempter who turns the clever imitator into a faker, and the middleman who lures on the unwary collector with plausible tales. It is not the object of this volume to study the faker by himself, but to trace his career through the ages in his appropriate surroundings, and compare the methods adopted by him at various periods of history, so far as they may be obtained. Ethically there is a strict line drawn between the imitator and the forger, but in practice this line is by no means rigid. Many imitators place their goods before the public as imitations. Others tacitly permit their work to be sold as genuinely antique, influenced no doubt by the fact that though possibly the imitation and the original may possess equal merit, the one is handicapped by modernity, the other is hallowed by age. The inexperienced and unwary collector is in most cases the innocent originator of fraud. If there were no buyer there would be no seller. Too often fashion leads folly, and so fictitious values are created, and as demand increases so, too, do the sources of supply, but unhappily they are frequently not legitimate. Riccardo Nobili. Ville Maria, Via Dante de Castiglione 3, Florence. End of preface. Chapter 1 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Part 1. The Birth and Development of Faking. Chapter 1. Greeks and Romans as Art Collectors. Why the Greeks by not being collectors in the modern sense were spared faking in art. How the Romans became interested in art. Genesis of their art collections. The first collectors and their methods. Noted citizens' indictment against art plundering of Roman conquerors. Attitude of noted writers towards art and art collecting. The collector, the chief patron of fakery, being somewhat of a selfish lover of art, it is quite natural that the Greeks, who saw in art a grand means of public education and enjoyment, cannot be called art collectors in the modern sense of the word. Consequently, there was hardly room for sham art in a country where art, as the direct emanation of public spirit, was rigorously maintained for the sake of the people. It was the temples that became art emporiums, museums that everyone was allowed to enjoy, or free institutions, like the Pinacotheia of the Acropolis, the collection of carved stones at the Parthenon, the gymnasium of the Areopagus, containing a collection of busts of the most celebrated philosophers. With this public spirit in the enjoyment of art, Delphi gathered a famous picture gallery in the oracular temple and, according to Pliny, possessed no fewer than 3,000 statues, one of them being the famous golden Apollo. From this temple Nero carried off 500 bronze statues, and later on Constantine removed many of the remaining works of art to Constantinople. An identical spirit of public enjoyment of art had turned the temples of Juno in Olympia, of Minerva in Plataea and Syracuse into veritable museums of art and curiosities also. The temple of Minerva at Linden, in the island of Rhodes, for instance, contained a cup of electrum (amber) offered by Helen of Troy, which was said to have a cavity cut to the exact shape of the bosom of the beautiful wife of Paris. Pliny, Book 33, Chapter 23. That the Greeks at their highest historical level did not indulge in the private and artistic delights of the collector may also be gathered from the poor construction of their usual dwelling houses. It is well known that thieves, more especially in Athens, were called wall breakers and obtained this odd nickname from their peculiar method of entering houses, namely by making a hole through the wall rather than troubling to unlock the door. Such flimsy dwellings can hardly have sheltered the treasures of an art collection. Thus simplicity of customs and a clearly defined manner of enjoying art saved the Greeks to a great extent from a regular trade in antiques with all its strange and deplorable etceteras. As a matter of fact we have no information as to anything that might be called a private art collection in Athens, though quite consistently, considering their extreme passion for knowledge, the Greeks had fine private libraries, such as those of Aristotle and Theophrastus. But even these, though containing the rarest and most precious works, were true libraries, not collections of elaborate volumes. The mania for fine bindings of costly material was later on the caprice of the learned Roman, not of the Greek. The home of the collector, and consequently of his faithful companion the faker, was Rome. The Roman was not a born lover of art. In fact, during the early and primitive period of its existence, Rome had not only been somewhat negative as regards art, but was even rather averse from its enjoyment. It took centuries for the Romans to overcome the belief that matters of art were trifling amusements that might be left as toys to their conquered people. Thus for a long time Romans saw in the enjoyment of art the chief source of the weakening and degeneration of the enemies they had subjugated. Springing from a progeny of soldiers and agriculturists, born to conquer the world, the Roman citizen assumed as an aphorism the Virgilian saying that his sole duty was to subjugate enemies by granting them pardon or humiliating their pride. Thus the early Romans not only show great ignorance as to marvels of art, but even contempt for them. When art treasures were brought to Rome as booty for the first time by Marcellus from conquered Sicily, the Senate censured such an innovation. Fabius Maximus, called the Shield of Rome, rose among others in protest, saying that after the siege of Tarentum he, unlike Marcellus, had brought home only gold and valuable plunder. As for statues, more especially images, he had preferred to leave to the conquered people their enraged gods. In fact, the only statue Fabius took away from Tarentum was the Hercules of Lysippus, a bronze colossus which must have appealed to him either for its historic size or the large quantity of material. A type of the early ignorant Roman art collector is given by Lucius Mummius, a general who destroyed Corinth, and of whom Velleius Paterculus tells, chapter 1, part 13, that in sending to Rome what might be styled the artistic booty of the destroyed city, he consigned the statues and paintings to those in charge of the transport with the warning that should the goods be lost they would be held responsible and would have to reproduce them all at their own expense. Even when, with the progress of time, art was finally appreciated in Rome, the old contempt for it was transferred in a way from the product to the maker. Thus with the feeling that seems to characterize the parvenu in art, and with inexplicable inconsistency, the Roman lover of art persisted in seeing in the artist either a slave or a good-for-nothing, and never for a moment regarded the artist as worth the consideration he granted to art. Notwithstanding his belief of being a lover of art and an intelligent connoisseur, Cicero calls statues and paintings toys to amuse children, oblectamenta puerorum. In his fourth oration, In Verem, he candidly confesses that he fails to understand the importance attached by Greeks to those arts which the Romans most rightly despise. Valerius Maximus, who lived at the time of Tiberius, that is to say when Rome had fully completed its education in art, calls the profession of the painter a vile occupation, sordidum studium, and wonders how Fabius, a Roman and patrician, can bring himself to sign his painting with full name and qualification Fabius Pictor, Book 8, Chapter 14, Part 6. In one of his letters, number 88, Seneca, the contemporary of Nero, states that sculpture and painting are unworthy to be classified as liberal arts. Petronius, the Magister Elegantiorum of Rome, 200 years after the destruction of Corinth, that is to say when Rome had reached its maturity in the understanding of art, calls Apelles, Phidias and other famous artists of Greece crack-brained. Graeculi delirantes. With such an innately negative sense of art and strong racial prejudice, it is not surprising that when brought to an appreciation of art by circumstances, the Romans, though willing and fully prepared to pay extravagant prices for works of art, should still retain their old contempt for artists. Those Graeculi delirantes who had come to beautify the capital as slaves or tempted by gain. As a result of this peculiar feeling and in full contrast with the Greek sentiment which has handed down to posterity a great deal about the artists who lived in Athens and the honours they received, Rome has preserved for us hardly a name of painter, sculptor or architect. And they must have been legion if we consider the magnitude of the work accomplished. Vitruvius, Book 7, Chapter 15, informs us that Damophilus, Gorgas, Agesilas, Pasiteles and other artists were called to Rome by Julius Caesar, and that so many Greek artists were in Rome that when the temple of Jupiter Olympicus was to be finished in Athens, the citizens were obliged to send to Rome, as none of their architects were to be found in Greece. It is interesting to trace how the Romans gradually became collectors of art, and how there gradually developed in Rome a whole world of lovers of art with all its true and fictitious enthusiasms, furnishing a group of varied types of collectors not altogether dissimilar from those of our modern society of lovers of art. As we have said, conquest and booty furnished the first articles of virtu. At first statues and objects of art of all kinds were brought to Rome without discrimination. Then education gradually progressed, taste developed and plunder became more enlightened. Fulvius Nobilior, to quote one of the many conquerors who brought artistic war booty to Rome, enriched it with 285 bronze statues, 230 marble ones, and 112 pounds of gold ornaments. Following the custom of the Greeks, the Romans at first presented statues and paintings to various temples as ornaments. Later on, with more discrimination and less greed, Roman officials proceeded to a systematic spoliation of Greece and the Orient of their treasures of art. Statues and paintings followed in the triumphs of Roman generals, as did slaves and prisoners of war. Occasionally returning officials brought home with them pillaged artistic mementos of the place they had been ruling in the name of mighty Rome. Thus Fulvius, consul in Ambracia, brought home the finest statues of that country. One of these mementos was excavated in the year 1867. It bore the naïve and candid confession of the consul: Marcus Fulvius Marci Filius Servii Nepos Nobilior consul Ambracia capit. Having carried off the statues of the 9 Muses in his conquest of Ambracia, this same Fulvius Nobilior placed them in the temple of Hercules. At this time Roman conquerors had progressed and they already travelled with experts and advisers. Fulvius Nobilior was accompanied by the poet Ennius (Strabo, Book 10, Chapter 5), whose suggestion it may have been to place Hercules in the midst of the 9 Muses playing the lyre like an Apollo, a metamorphosis of the god showing that the Roman had finally harmonized strength, his chief and most cherished quality, with the gentler feelings of an understanding of art. This Hercules Musagetes seems to symbolize a first conquest of art over the rude, sturdy Roman character. Departing from the established rule of presenting their artistic plunder to the temples after it had followed in their triumphs to enhance the importance of their conquest, in time the generals began to keep part of the spoils themselves. In this way were the first private collections in Rome formed. The real artistic education of the Romans dates from this time. The passion and ambition to enrich and embellish private houses helped to teach what was worth consideration. Sulla, who plundered Greece and Asia Minor, is said to have acquired a sure eye for valuable objets de virtu. Verres, who with an excellent eye had robbed and collected all that came within his reach, was perhaps Rome's best connoisseur of art. He and Sulla were practically the first to organize that enlightened manner of plundering subjugated countries that finally made Rome the first emporium of art in the world. Naturally, these early Roman collectors rarely brought their articles of virtu. When they could not obtain by pillage they had ready to hand a speedy and coercive means of gratifying their artistic craving. Sulla placed on the proscription list the names of all possessors of artistic objects who were so unwise as to refuse to give them up to him. Mark Antony did the same to Verres. The latter paid with his life his refusal to offer the despotic triumvir some famous vases of Corinthian bronze which he sorely longed to have in his collection. It was, we repeat, in Sulla's time that the passion for collecting arose among the Romans, not only guided by an artistic sense of discrimination, but with all the peculiar characteristics that seem to attend the development of this passion. Sulla's collection, to which the spoils of the temple of Apollo in Delphi and of the temples of Jupiter in Elis and Aesculapius in Epidaurus, considered the richest emporium of art in Greece, had contributed, must have been magnificent and without an equal, except, perhaps, that of Verres, Sulla's pupil, who surpassed his master in the art of plundering and sacked Sicily of all that the island possessed of art. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 2 Collectomania in Rome. Collectomania develops. Rampant parvenuism in Rome. Extravagant prices paid for art and curio. Faking arrives. good and foolish collectors as seen by writers and satirists of the time. Art dealing. The septæ, shops and auction rooms. Such was the earliest type of the real collector of art in Rome, a first phase in a city where the passion for art was, generally speaking, rarely genuine. This phase led first to the acquisition of what might be styled something between ambition and love of display. Then the trade in objects of art eventually appeared, and as a logical consequence, imitation and fraudulent art finally had their scope. Fictitious masterpieces of painting and sculpture, often signed, as in modern times, with the forged names of noted artists, were already on the market before Cicero's time. Odi falsas inscriptiones statuarum alienarum. I hate the forged inscriptions on statues not one's own, remarks Cicero, who, although somewhat of a collector himself, never missed a chance to ridicule the pretentious amateur lost in hysterical ecstasy before imitations supposed to be original works, or of fanning the art lover's pseudo-enthusiasm for the works of Polycletus, which was extremely fashionable at one time among art collectors. Thus forgery received a great impulse when art reached its climax in Rome and multiplied the number of collectors, dragging after it in its triumphal march wealth and all the fickle forces of wealth. Taste in art, then, became apparently more exclusive, or rather, according to Quintilian, more unstable in its standards. Nowadays, says the Latin rhetorician and critic, they prefer the childish monochrome works of Polycletus and Aglaïphon to the more expressive and more recent artists. Yet, very likely not understanding this not unusual love for the archaic and the odd, so common in collectors of all ages, Quintilian cannot explain the preference for work he considers gross, except by fashion or what we should call today a snobbish sentiment. Criticizing the art in vogue, he adds, in fact, I should call this art childish compared to that of most illustrious artists who came afterwards, but in my judgment it is, of course, only pretension. Book 12, Chapter 10. It is evident that with the Romans as with us, the times are not entirely dissimilar, indeed but for art critics, the new modern fad, they might be called identical. Prices paid for works of art, or simple curiosities, became freakish and fabulous, going up or down in a single period according to fickle fashion. The momentary passion for murrhines, for instance, tempted a collector to pay for one of these cups of fluorspar a sum approximating £14,200. Another mania succeeded, that of tables made of citrus, a species of rare wood, possibly thuja, grown on the slopes of Mount Athos. Carthagus invested in one of these fashionable tables a sum equivalent to £12,000. Then at another time wrought silver became the rage, and prices for this article soon reached absurd figures. When Chrysogon, Sulla's wealthy freedman, was bidding at an auction for a silver autepsa, a plate warmer, people standing outside the auction imagined he was buying a farm from the high sum he offered. As might be expected, high prices tempted brainless parvenus. There were many in Rome like that Demasippus of whom Horace said insanit veteris statuas Demasippus emendo. Satires, chapter 3. The type of snobbish visionary and sham art seeker who bought roughly carved statues, supplying their defects with his fancy, and who, in speaking of his historical pieces, stated that to be admitted into his very choicest collection a basin must at least have served Sisyphus, son of Aeolus, as a footbath. Next to this foolish type of collector of art, Rome possessed a great many other characters, who, like those of today, might be classified as odd specimens of art lovers. "Isn't Euctus a bore with his historical silver?" asks Martial, adding that he would rather eat off the common earthenware of Saguntus than hear all the gabble concerning Euctus' table silver. Think of it! His cups belonged to Laomedon, king of Troy. And mind, to obtain these rarities Apollo played upon his lyre and destroyed the wall of the city by inducing the stones to follow him by his music. But concerning this odd type of collector Martial merits quotation. "Now, what do you think of this vase?" asks Euctus of his table companions. "Well, it belonged to old Nestor himself. Do you see that part all worn away, there where the dove is? It was reduced to that state by the hand of the king of Pylos. Then showing one of those mixing bowls that Latins called crater, this was the cause of the battle between the ferocious Rheucus and the Lapithae. Naturally every cup has its particular history. This is the very cup used by the sons of Aeacus when offering most generous wine to their friend. That is the cup from which Dido drank to the health of Bythius when she offered him that supper in Phrygia. Finally, when he has bored his guests to death, Euctus offers them, in the cup from which Pyramus used to drink, wine as young as Astyanax." Trimalcho is so well known that we are dispensed from a detailed illustration. Petronius must have drawn from life this capital character of his Satyricon. Like Euctus, Trimalcho extols the historic merits of his articles of virtu. He has the same mania for inviting people to his table and forcing them to admire his rarities. He talks very much in the same manner as the type quoted by Martial. Thus he informs his guests that his Corinthian vases are the best and most genuine in existence, because they were made at his order by a workman named Corinth. As a side explanation of this remark, fearing that the guest might suppose he did not know the historic origin of the metal, he adds, "Yes, yes, I know all about it, don't take me for an ignoramus, I know the origin of this metal perfectly well. It was at the capture of Troy when Hannibal, a shrewd brigand by the way, threw on to a burning pyre all the statues of gold and silver and bronze. The mixture of the metals produced the alloy from which the goldsmiths have made plates, vases and figures. From this, of course, comes the name of Corinth to designate this mix-up of three metals, which, of course, is no more any of the three." Trimalcho also possesses a cup with a bas relief representing Cassandra cutting her children's throats. Not content with this gorgeous historical blunder, and forgetting that he is talking of the bas relief of a cup, Trimalcho adds as an artistic comment that the bodies of Cassandra's children are so lifelike that one might suspect they had been cast from nature. Continuing our comparison with Euctus, we may add that Trimalcho also possesses a rare pitcher with a bas relief representing Daedalus putting Niobe inside the wooden horse of Troy. When he has finished maiming history and the guests have patiently listened to his fantastic tales, like a true parvenu, Trimalcho never fails to add, "Mind, it is all massive precious metal. It is all my very own as you see, and not to be sold at any price." Except for the wording, a trifling difference, the word "expensive" would play a conspicuous part with the Trimalcho of today, decorated, be it understood, with precious, rare, unique and all the rest of the arch superlatives of modern idioms. Such collectors have not been lost to our day. But there are other types worth quoting. They will certainly help us to understand the part played by art imitations and forgery among the Romans, and how the existence of fraud was in some way justified, that in the end the one chiefly responsible for the existence of faking was the collector himself. This understanding will be greatly aided by a glimpse at the septæ, antiquity or simple bric-à-brac shops. that were grouped together in certain streets of ancient Rome, like they are nowadays. Like today, too, sales of art were effected by auctions or by private dealing, the latter in shops or through the usual go-between, the so-called courtier of our time. Public auctions were announced by placards or a simple writing on the walls. An idea of what these announcements were like is given by the following one from Plautus's Menoikme. Within 7 days, in the morning, sale of Menoikme. There will be sold slaves, furniture, houses, farms, every article bought must be paid for at the time of buying. As in our days, an exhibition of the goods preceded the auction. These shows were held in appropriate rooms adorned with porticos, called atria auctionaria. In speaking of such exhibitions and commenting upon some special one, Cicero remarks auctionis vero miserabilis ad spectus. 2 Philippic, section 29. Curiously enough, the auction sales of the herbs were provided with an employee whose function seems to have survived in the public sales of Paris. The Latin praeco is something like the French crieur, whose office it is at public auctions to extol and praise the objects offered for sale. It must be said that the praeco, however, was not only a simple crieur, but at times a sort of director of the sale, thus combining the functions of commissaire-priseur, expert and crieur. But it was certainly in the latter function that his ability best contributed to the success of the sale. Some of these employees must have enriched themselves like regular commissaire-priseurs. Horace, Epistles, Book 1, section 7, describes one of these crieurs as indulging in luxury, making money easily and scattering it like water, allowing himself every kind of pleasure and yielding tremendously to fashion. A curious description suggesting that this Vulteius Menas of Horace must have had the lucky career of some of the Parisian auction employees and cannot have been indifferent to that form of gay self-indulgence that Parisians call faire la bombe. Speaking of auctions and the way Romans disposed of their goods to the highest bidder, it is worth while to refer to what Suetonius tells us happened at the sale held by Caligula, who being short of money thought fit one day to put up to auction everything in the royal palace that was either useless or considered out of fashion. Quidquid instrumenti veteris aulae erat. According to Suetonius, not only was the emperor himself present at the auction, but he put prices on the various objects, bidding on them as well. An old praetor, Apponius Saturninus, became sleepy during the sale, and in dozing kept on nodding his head. Caligula noticed it and told the auctioneer not to lose sight of that buyer and to put up the price each time Saturninus nodded. When the old man finally awoke he realized that without knowing it he had bought at the imperial auction about £80,000 worth of goods. Caligula, section 39. Pliny relates an amusing story which shows that then, as now, the auctioneer was allowed to group objects. At a sale, he says, Theonius, the crieur, made a single lot of a fine bronze candelabra and a slave named Clesippus, humpbacked and extremely ugly. The courtesan Gegania bought the lot for 50,000 sesterces, about £400. The same night at supper she showed her acquisitions, exhibiting the naked slave to the gibes of the guests, then yielding to a freakish passion, made of him her lover and heir. Clesippus thus became extremely wealthy and worshipped the candelabra with a devotion as though it were his god. Book 34, section 6. As stated above, other sales generally took place in various parts of Rome, where antiquaries and bric-à-brac dealers had assembled their shops. A great many of these merchants had gathered in the Via Sancta, or the Septa of the Via Publica, or the Septa Julia. Those parts of Roman streets called septi, where antiquaries and bric-à-brac dealers had their dens, were the amateur fool's paradise and trap, and very likely they were as inviting and picturesque as similar places in modern European towns today. These shops and shows, it is said, offered real rarities at times, such as bronzes of Aegina by Myron, Delos bronzes by Polyclitus, genuine rarities in Corinthian bronze, marvels in chiselling signed by Boethus or Miss. The septi not only exhibited artistic pieces but also sham rarities that had won public appreciation in a moment of fashion. Among these was a certain kind of candelabra shaped like a tree with one or more branches. Concerning these candelabras, which were almost made to supplant the more artistic ones by a fad, Pliny remarks, "Arborum mala ferentium modo locentes," like trees bearing shining apples, and states with caustic humour that although their name bore a common etymology with the word candela, candle, a cheap means of lighting, they were sold at prices equivalent to the yearly appointment of a military tribune. Pliny, Book 34, Chapter 8. Speaking of candelabras, it may be stated that the finest ever seen in Rome belonged to Verres, being part of the vast plunder of Sicily he accumulated when stationed there by Rome as proconsul. This fact prompted the sarcastic remark in Cicero's indictment of the proconsul, that Verres had in his triclinium a candelabra casting light where darkness would have been more appropriate. This rich candelabra must have been of a statuesque size, the kind Lucretius describes, si non aurea sunt juvenum simulacra per aedes, lampadas igniferas manibus retinentia dextris. Book 2, Chapter 24. Figures of youths holding lighted lamps in their right hands. Naturally, it was not only a single speciality, valued through fashion or fad, that was to be found on the market, it was a regular emporium of antiquities in art, and of all kinds of bric-à-brac. Beside murrhines, tables of citrus and other specialties, there were paintings of all schools and sizes down to miniatures, an art not unknown to the Romans. There were also sculpture, ceramics, fine pieces of Rhegium and Cumae, Maltese tapestries, Oriental embroideries, etc. In fact, mixed with a good deal that was dubious, these places also offered fine treasures, as Martial says, "Hic ubi Roma suas aurea vexit opes," here where golden Rome brought her treasure. It is easy to understand that the people moving in this milieu were not dissimilar from those who indulge in articles of virtu in our enlightened times, or who are somewhat of a victim to the collector passion. Such a milieu, not to be found in Athens where the passion for art was genuine and essential, was quite consistent in Rome, where improvised Croesuses and rich parvenus abounded. Parvenus who, like many of the collectors of our time, took to buying objects of art as a fad or hobby. This type of collector is easily recognized and in its grotesqueness is not essentially different from some of our modern society. It is true that Rome also produced many genuine lovers of art, many first-rate connoisseurs and collectors such as Agrippa, magnificent collectors of the calibre of Cæsar, keen, intelligent lovers of art, as greedy as unscrupulous, such as Sulla, Verres and Mark Antony. But, as in America today, the magnitude of quickly made fortunes, the impetus of a passion suddenly aroused without any previous preparation, produced only a few types of the true collector. As in America now, for one Quincy Shaw, how many a Trimalcho and Euctus. Needless to say, the art market generally follows the inclination of the client. It tries to meet his taste, whims and fads. It may be scrupulous or unscrupulous according to circumstances, and, particularly in art and antiques, these circumstances chiefly depend on the great despotic ruler of all markets, the client. Thus in the Septi, side by side with Firminius, Clodius and Gratianus, dealers enjoying an undisputed reputation in the Sigillaria (image market) and other quarters where antiquary shops were gathered, there were to be noted types like the Milonius, of whom Martial says, rare stuffs, chiselled silver, cloaks, togas, precious stones, there is nothing you don't sell, Milo, and your clients invariably carry their acquisitions away with them. After all, your wife is the best article in your emporium, always bought and never taken away from your shop. Books 7 to 12, section 102. The whole gamut of oddities with which the collecting mania abounds were really to be found in the Septi. There was the particular collector who has no eyes but for one certain thing, no enthusiasm but for the object specializing his particular hobby, as Horace remarks in his satires about people who have either the passion for silver pieces or bronze. Hunc capit argenti splendor stuped albius are. This one the glitter of silver holds. Albius stands dumb before bronze. Seneca informs us that in his time there was an amateur with the hobby of collecting rusty fragments, another who had gone so crazy over small vases of Corinthian bronze that he spent his days handling the pieces of his collection, taking them down from the shelves, putting them back up again and continually arranging and rearranging them. De Brevitate Vitae, chapter 12. Martial tells us of a man who made a collection of pieces of amber containing fossilized insects, and another collector who boasted that he had a fragment of the ship Argo among the rare pieces of his collection. There was also Clarinus, a debauchee, according to Martial, who vaunted himself upon possessing samples of all the goldsmith's art of his time. But, remarks Martial, this man's silver cannot be pure. Another type noted by Martial makes one realize that there is a species of collector that will never die. Of Paulus, Martial observes, his friends, like his paintings and his antiques, all for show. Book 12, chapter 69. Codrus, quoted by Juvenal, is the needy collector. He keeps his books in an old basket where mice allow themselves the luxury of nibbling the works of divine Greece. He sleeps on a pallet shorter than his little wife. His collection and furniture are all in his bedroom, the only room he has for living and sleeping in, and conspicuous are 6 cups, a small cantarium on the console, with a figure of Chiron the centaur below it. Book 3. Eros is another type, that of the mournful collector. This is the way Martial describes this not unusual type. Eros weeps every time he comes across some fine murrhine of jasper or a finely marked table of citrus. He sighs and sighs from the bottom of his heart, for he is not rich enough to buy all the objects of the sceptre. And here, Martial comments, how many are like Eros without showing it, and how many banter him for his tears and sighs and yet in their hearts feel like him. Book 10, chapter 80. Mamurra, another type handed down to us by the inexhaustible Martial, never misses a day without visiting the sceptre, spends hours in gadding about, reviews the rows of young slaves which he devours with the eye of a critic, not, if you please, the common ones, but the choicest samples, those that are not on show to everyone, not to common people like us, adds Martial. When he has had enough of this show, he goes to examine the furniture. There he discovers some rich tables orbes, round tables, hidden under some covering. Then he orders that some pieces of ivory furniture he wishes to examine be taken down from the highest spot. Afterwards he passes on to examine a hexaclinon, a couch used in the triclinium, with 6 places, veneered with tortoiseshell, and measures it 4 times. What a pity it is not big enough to match his citrus table. A minute later he goes to smell a bronze. Does it really smell of the Corinthian alloy? Of course he is ready to criticize even your statues, O Polykleitos. Then those 2 rock crystals are not pure, some are a trifle nebulous, others are marred by slight imperfections. Ah, here's a murrhine. He orders about a dozen to be put aside. He goes to handle some old cups as if he would weigh the merit of each one, more especially that of Mentor. He goes to count the emeralds on a golden vase, and the enormous pearls we see dangling together on the ears of our elegant ladies. Afterwards he goes to look everywhere on every side for real sardonyx. His specialty is to collect large and rare pieces of jasper. Finally, about the 11th hour of the day, Mamurra is completely exhausted. He must go home. He buys for an ass, less than 3 farthings, 2 bowls and takes them with him. Book 9, chapter 59. Tongilius is the ponderous, important collector. He goes through the places where the antiques are sold in an oversized palanquin, and with his cortege and train of followers upsets everybody and everything. Juvenal, by whom his character is handed down to us, remarks rather sarcastically: Spondet enim Tyrio strataria purpura philo, et tamen est illis hoc utili. Satires, chapter 7. Licinius is the type of the lunatic lover of art. He has a fine collection, is wealthy, and can buy the most expensive objects of virtu. But he is far from happy. His mania is the fear that his rarities may be stolen or become the prey of fire. He keeps hordes of slaves watching his precious curios night and day. At night, says Juvenal, a cohort of guardians sits up with buckets of water ready to hand in case of emergencies. The poor man is in continual fear for his statues, his amber figures, his ivory and tortoise shell veneered furniture. Naturally, in contrast to the foolish type of collector who seems to have kindled the verve of Roman satirists, the true amateur was to be found, and most select collections of art were known in Rome. Among these also the city afforded all the types of the true collector, the selfish one who never showed his collection to anyone, and the man who gathered objects of art chiefly to share the enjoyment of them with others. Some of these latter wished the public to have the benefit of their purchases and adorned porticos and public places with their collection. According to Statius, Vindex is the real connoisseur. Who can compete with him? Remarks the poet in his Silvae Liber Quartus. Who possesses so sober an eye? He is deeply versed in the technical procedure of all the artists of antiquity, and when a work bears no signature he can decide at sight to which master it belongs. He will point you out a bronze that has cost the learned Myron many a day's and night's work, the marble to which Praxiteles' untiring chisel has given life, the ivory polished by the hands of Phidias, the bronzes of Polykleitus which seem to breathe life on coming out of the furnace. He can see the artistic line, the true mark of all authentic Apelles. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 3 Rapacious Roman Collectors. Some collectors' hobbies. Sulla idolized statuette. Verres, the most rapacious of Roman art collectors. Mark Antony and his speedy methods. Cicero as an art lover. Pompey, the unselfish art lover. Julius Caesar. Shrewd and impassive connoisseurs like Sulla also had their hobbies and fancies. Sulla's particular fancy was a little statue of Apollo he had pillaged from the temple of Delphi. This statue was more to him than all the rest of the precious things forming his unique collection. From this little god, called by Winckelmann Sulla's private travelling god, he never separated. He used to kiss it devoutly and seems to have consulted it in great emergencies. At times he used to carry it in his breast, says Plutarch. We may note by the way that this Apollo was not considered by connoisseurs the best piece of Sulla's collection. The real gem was his Hercules, a work by Lysippus. The story of this Hercules is told by Martial and Statius, who inform us that it measured a little less than a Roman foot, about 9 inches. Notwithstanding its modest dimensions, the statuette was modelled with such grandeur and majestic sentiment as to cause Statius to comment "Parvusque videri centurique ingens." Small in appearance, but immense in effect. It represented Hercules in a smilingly serene attitude, seated on a rock, holding a club in his right hand and in the other a cup. It was in fact one of those statuettes which Romans called by the Greek word epitrapezios, and which were placed on dining tables as the genius loci of the repast. The history of this gem of Sulla's collection is uncommon, and its vicissitudes most remarkable. The statue was originally a gift made by Lysippus to Alexander the Great. This sovereign and conqueror was so attached to Lysippus' present that he carried the statue with him wherever he went. When dying he indulged in a touching adieu to the cherished statuette. After Alexander, the little Hercules fell into the hands of another conqueror, Hannibal. It is not known how he came to be the possessor of Lysippus' work, but it may be explained by the fact that Hannibal, being a collector of art and somewhat of a connoisseur, and, above all, as Cornelius Nepos states, a great admirer of Greek art, was a keen-eyed hunter after rarities in art. However, be that as it may, Hannibal seems to have been possessed by the same fancy as Alexander, for he carried the little statue with him on all his peregrinations, and even took it to Bithynia, where, as history informs us, he destroyed himself by poison. At his death the Hercules passed in all probability into the hands of Prusias, at whose court Hannibal died. A century later the statue reappeared in Sulla's collection. Very likely it came into Sulla's possession as a present from King Nicomedes, who owed gratitude to Sulla for the restitution of the throne of Bithynia. After Sulla's death it is difficult to locate this precious statue of his famous collection. Presumably it passed from one collector to another and never left Rome. Perhaps, says Statius, it found its place in more than one imperial collection. The statue reappears officially, however, under Domitian. At this time it is in the possession of the above quoted Vindex, a Gaul living in Rome, a friend of Martial and Statius, and one of the best art connoisseurs of his time. At Vindex's death the statuette disappears again, and no mention of it has ever been made since by any writer. What may the fate have been of this chef d'œuvre of Lysippus which passed from one collection to another for more than 4 centuries? Among greedy lovers of art, with a connoisseur's eye as good as his soul was unscrupulous, Verres takes the prize. He had learned the rapacious trade of art looting under Sulla. Later on, not being powerful enough nor daring to go to the length of the dictator by placing reluctant amateurs on the list of proscribed, he studiously sought to gain his end by all forms of violence and vexatious methods. When in Sicily as proconsul, he actually despoiled and denuded every temple in the island. "I defy you," says Cicero in his indictment of Verres, "to find now in Sicily, this rich province, so old, with opulent families and cities, a single silver vase, a bronze of Corinth or Delos, one single precious stone or pearl, a single work in gold or ivory, a single bronze, marble or ivory statue. I defy you to find a single painting, a tapestry, that Verres has not been after, examined and, if pleasing to him, pillaged." As for private property, when he heard of a citizen possessing some object that excited his cupidity, to Verres all means of extortion seemed good, including torture and fustigation. His passion was of such an uncontrolled nature that even when invited to dinner by his friends he could not resist scraping with his knife the fine bas reliefs of the silver plates and hiding them in the folds of his toga. Yet this greedy, unscrupulous amateur, whom Cicero mercilessly indicted in his In Verrem, was such a lover of the objects of his collection that he faced death rather than give up some fine vases of Corinthian bronze which Mark Antony had demanded from him as a forced gift. Mark Antony, who followed Sulla's methods in forming one of the finest collections, was, like his violent predecessors, a type of collector which finds no counterpart in our times. His fine library had cost many victims, his taste being rather eclectic, there seems to have been no security in Rome for any kind of amateur who happened to possess rare and interesting curios. Nonius was proscribed because he refused to part with a rare opal, a precious stone of the size of a hazelnut. "What an obstinate man that Nonius," remarks Pliny, Book 37, chapter 21, most candidly, "to be so attached to an object for which he was proscribed. Animals are certainly wiser when they abandon to the hunter that part of their body for which they are being chased." Mark Antony was not so good a connoisseur as Verres, but having no less a passion for collecting art and being no less unscrupulous and more in a position to use violence without the risk of being accused before the Roman citizens, as happened to Verres in the end, there was no limit to his schemes. After the battle of Pharsalia he managed to seize all Pompey's artistic property, as well as his furniture and gardens, and after Cæsar's murder Antony, to whom we owe one of the finest orations ever conceived, the one he delivered before the dead body of his friend, lost no time in plundering Cæsar's property and transporting to his gardens all the objects of art Cæsar had left to the people of Rome. The information comes from Cicero with these words: "The statues and pictures with which his gardens Cæsar bequeathed to the people, he (Antony) carried off partly to his garden at Pompeii, partly to his country house." Speaking of this collection, it is believed that the colossal Jupiter, now in the Louvre Museum, not only belonged to Mark Antony, but was the work of Myron which the Triumvir had stolen from Samos. Should this be so, the pedigree of this statue is one of the few that can be actually traced through the centuries. Brought to Rome by Mark Antony, this Jupiter was later placed in the Capitol by Augustus. The fine statue was then passed from one emperor to another to sink into the general oblivion of art at the end of the Roman Empire. It reappears in Rome in the 16th century. It was then in the possession of Marguerite of Antioch, Duchess of Camerino. The statue was greatly mutilated, having lost both legs and arms. The Duchess presented what remained of this famous Jupiter to Perronet de Granvelle. Subsequently Cardinal and Minister of Charles V, on his retirement to his native country, Perronet de Granvelle took the Jupiter to Besançon and placed it in the garden of his castle. When Louis XIV took Besançon, the magistrates of the city offered the French monarch what he might otherwise have taken, the statue of Jupiter. Transferred from Besançon to Versailles, this magnificent statue, which by rare chance had escaped serious damage during the barbarian ages, finally met two authentic barbarians in the artists charged with its restoration. To clean off the old patina from the statue, think of it, Girardon had a layer of marble taken off with the chisel, and Drouy, not perceiving that the god had been formerly in a sitting posture, or more probably not choosing to notice the fact as not appealing to his artistic conception, made the Jupiter a standing statue by adjusting and cutting the parts otherwise in the way for this kind of adaptation. The only part of the statue that does not seem to have suffered any damage is the head. Even Brutus and Cassius appear not to have been indifferent to the collector passion. Brutus, more especially, used to devote to the collecting of art the less agitated moments of his troubled life. The gem of his collection was considered to be a bronze by Strongylion. Pliny tells us that this statue of Brutus was called the young Philippian. Strongylion fecit puerum, quem emando Brutus Philippiensis cognomine suo illustravit. Book 34, chapter 19. Cicero may be quoted as a type of the inconsistent art collector. A man of dubious artistic taste and snobbish tendencies, but who becomes a true art collector when he specializes in that part of art collecting more closely in keeping with his studies. Thus in his letter to Atticus he reveals his love of books and old Greek words, and how fond he was of good bindings, etc. As a collector of art, Cicero leaves one doubtful as to his tastes and connoisseurship, qualities to which he seems to lay claim in more than one of his speeches. When he writes to his friend Atticus, his good counsellor, the man charged to buy art for him, he does not express himself either as a real lover of art or as a genuine connoisseur. "Buy me anything that is suited for the decoration of my Tusculum," he writes to Atticus. "Hermathena might be an excellent ornament for my academy. Hermes are placed now in all gymnasia. I have built exedras according to the latest fashion. I should like to put paintings there as an ornament, etc." In Paradoxa, a collection of philosophical thoughts called Socratic in style by Cicero, in which he says he has called a spade, Socratica longeque verissima, Cicero has the courage to write the following paragraph in defence of Carneades, who maintained that the head of a faun had been found in the raw marble of a quarry at Chios. "One calls the thing imaginary, a freak of chance, just as if marble could not contain the forms of all kinds of heads, even those of Praxiteles. It is a fact that these heads are made by taking away the superfluous marble, and in modelling them even a Praxiteles does not add anything of his own, because when much marble has been taken away one reaches the real form, and we see the accomplished work which was there before. This is what may have happened in the quarry of Chios." The gamut of art collectors would not be complete without quoting a few samples of worthy art lovers, who either understood art, like the Greeks, as a means of public enjoyment, or in some way showed genuine and most praiseworthy qualities as true collectors of art. It is doubtful whether the great Pompey really felt any pleasure in collecting art pieces, or whether he simply did it to ingratiate himself with the public. But as a matter of fact, his attitude towards the enjoyment of art was certainly a most unselfish character. Though he very sumptuously embellished his gardens on the Janiculum, this was nothing compared with the public buildings he enriched with rare statues, paintings, etc. His theatre was a magnificent emporium of art of which we possess some samples in the colossal Melpomene of the Louvre Museum and the bronze Hercules excavated under Pius IX, now one of the finest pieces of the Vatican collection. Both these statues were found buried on the spot where once the monumental theatre of Pompey had stood. But the artistic glories of this theatre were perhaps even surpassed by the interminable portico Pompey constructed and adorned for the benefit of the public. This spot, which was called the Promenade of Pompeius, became one of the fashionable walks of Rome. "You disdain," asked Propertius of his lady love, "the shady colonnades of Pompey's portico, its magnificent tapestries and the fine avenue of leafy plane trees?" Book 4, chapter 8. And in another place, Cynthia forbids her paramour this promenade with the words, "I prohibit you ever to strut in your best fineries in that promenade." Pliny, book 35, chapter 9, says that Pompey had some famous paintings in his galleries, and seems to have been more especially struck by a work by Polygnotus, representing a man on a ladder, and a landscape by Pausias. Curiously enough, the characteristics that seem to have attracted Pliny in the two works do not point to the noted writer as a great art critic. He says that the remarkable side of Polygnotus' painting was that the beholder could not tell whether the man on the ladder was ascending or descending, and that the main characteristic of Pausias' work consisted in two black oxen outlined on a dark landscape. Caesar, who showed himself to be a better connoisseur than his rival Pompey, and who, being of a more refined nature, would not, as did Pompey, have indulged in the gratification of parading the chlamys of Alexander the Great in a triumphal car drawn by 4 elephants, spent considerable sums on the embellishment of Rome with art. He also, like many collectors of art, had his hobbies, carrying with him through his various campaigns an endless number of precious mosaic tables, and always keeping in his tent a fine work of a Greek artist, a statue of Venus, with whom he claimed a relationship. Though he showed eclectic taste in his gifts to the town and temples, he was in private, like a true connoisseur and refined lover of art, somewhat of a specialist, being extremely fond of cameos and cut stones. Of these he had 6 distinct collections that held the admiration of all the connoisseurs of the city. He was, however, not only a passionate seeker after antiques, most boldly acquiring precious stones, curiosities, statues, pictures by old masters, gemmas, torumata, signa, tabulas operis antiqui animosissime comparasse, as Suetonius tells us, but also the ever ready patron of modern art. In this character he paid 80 talents, about £16,000, for a painting by Timonachus. Damophilus and Gorgas, painters, sculptors and decorators, worked for him to embellish the arena he built in Rome, an edifice capable of holding 2,500 spectators. Many artists worked at his Forum, a monument to his name for which he paid a sum equivalent to 20 million liras for the ground alone. Meanwhile he was also busy embellishing other cities of Italy, Gaul, Spain, Greece and even Asia. Suetonius states that Caesar sent a company of artists and workers to rebuild destroyed Corinth and to replace its statues on their pedestals. Being a most unselfish kind of lover of art, Caesar was one of the few who did not yield to the momentary fashion that led patricians to send their art pieces out of Rome, to embellish and decorate their country houses and magnificent villas. This peculiar fashion that exiled so many fine statues from Rome leads us to speak of another noble type of collector, Marcus Agrippa, who, like Caesar, not only set a good example by keeping all his treasures of art in Rome, mostly for the enjoyment of the public, but protested against the new custom and held meetings and lectures to dissuade wealthy Romans from sending away from the city their chefs d'œuvre. Such was the spirit characterizing Agrippa as a lover of art. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 4. Rome as an Art Emporium. Rome an art emporium. Every rich man is more or less a collector. Chrysagon, Sulla's freedman, competes with patricians. Scaurus' extravagant display, the type of a crack collector as described by Petronius Arbiter. The Roman palaces have special rooms for art gatherings. The Pinacothea, the library, the exedra, etc., according to the rules of Vitruvius. Fashion creates new distinctions in the appreciation of art and curios. The craze for Corinthian bronze and the classification of bronze patine. The hobby of murrhines and citrus tables. We do not know how many private collections there were in Rome when the collectomania finally took the city by storm. A list of Roman collectors in the fashion of the modern work, Ritz Pacot, would be most interesting and enlightening. However, judging from the statues and the public buildings we know to have been replete with objects of art, we gather that as an emporium of art Rome must have attained a magnitude unequalled in past or present times. Why this great collection of art did not transform the Romans into the most artistic people the world has ever seen is a mystery only to be solved by hypothesis. Either the Romans were innately refractory to the refinements of true art, or, like to all nouveaux riches, the field of art merely afforded room for faddists, hobbyists and fashion seekers, and only as sporadic cases, a few real lovers of good art. However this may be, without discussing the causes, the effect was certainly gigantic. Art from every land found its way to Rome, which by force of circumstances thus became a monumental synthesis of art. Even at the time of Constantine, Rome counted 10 basilicas, 11 forums, 11 thermes, 18 aqueducts, 8 bridges, 37 city gates, 29 military roads leading to all parts of the known world, 2 arenas, 8 theatres, 2 circuses, 37 triumphal arches, 5 obelisks, 2 colossal statues, 22 equestrian statues, 423 temples with statues of the gods, 8 of these being in solid gold and 77 in ivory. It is easy to understand that the above statistics only give a faint idea of the magnificence of Rome, for the 423 streets and 1,790 private palaces noted in the same statistic as existing in Rome at the time of Constantine were in a measure respectively open-air museums and repositories of private collections of art, as no patrician mansion, according to Vitruvius, was complete without a place where paintings and objects of art could be exhibited with advantage. Cicero allows us to peep at the collections and gorgeous palaces owned by notable Romans as well as their style of living. In his Oratio, Pro Roscio Amarino, he speaks of Chrysagon in these words. Look at Chrysagon when he comes down from his fine mansion on the Palatine. He owns a charming villa where he goes to rest, just at the gates of Rome. He also owns extensive domain, all magnificent and all near the city. His palace overflows with vases of Delos and Corinthian bronze. He keeps there the famous Autepsa bought by him some time ago at such a price that on hearing the auctioneer's voice repeat the bid, the passers-by imagined a farm was being offered for sale. What shall we say of his chiselled silver, his precious stuffs, his paintings, statues, marbles? How many of such things do you think he owns? Just imagine what has been pillaged from so many opulent families in times of trouble and rapine, and all for the repletion of one single palace. When one thinks that this Chrysagon, Sulla's freedman, had the chance to amass such an accumulation of art, it is not difficult to imagine the artistic wealth that must have been acquired by Scaurus, the terrible Sulla's unscrupulous son-in-law, the embezzler, the deplored and deplorable Roman aedile whom Cicero defended before the tribunal with the inconsistency of his easy eloquence. According to Pliny, Book 36, Scaurus not only owned one of the most magnificent palaces on the Palatine, but had his mansion crowded with rare things in true Roman fashion, with a Sulla for father-in-law, a Mutella, the purchaser of proscribed citizen goods, for mother, a Scaurus, the magna pars of the Senate and Marius's former friend and helper in the spoliation of provinces, for father. He can have had no difficulty, as Pliny informs us, in gathering the unequalled treasures that were stored in his palace. The wonders of the treasure of his art emporium are all the more easily explained, too, when we consider that he not only inherited a large fortune, but more than doubled it by speculations. To give some idea of his fatuous munificence, we may state that this Roman multi-millionaire built, for 1 month's performance, a theatre in the city to hold 80,000 spectators and adorns the edifice with 3,000 statues and 360 columns. Among the precious things of Scaurus' collection were a great number of paintings by Pausias, works intended by the artist for his native town of Sicyon, if the Romans had had milder methods of collecting art. Even those Romans, and they were many, who were not considered collectors in the proper sense, owned fine works of art. The Servilius, who had large gardens on the Palatine near the present Porta San Paulo, had what a modern connoisseur might call a few extra pieces. There was a Triptolemus, a Flora, and a Ceres by Praxiteles, a fine Vesta with 2 Vestals by Scopas, and an Apollo by Calamis. It may be mentioned, by the way, that it was to this famous garden Nero retired on the day preceding his death. It was here in the Servilian mansion that he was abandoned by his servants, parasites and courtiers, here that he wandered desolate and despondent before resorting to flight. On the spot formerly occupied by the Servilian gardens a mosaic was discovered, now in San Giovanni in Laterano, representing an unswept floor with the remains of a luxurious dinner. One might fancy this mosaic to have belonged to one of the Roman triclinia and their noted orgies, or, having the imagination of Ampere, the historian, to the place where Servilia had supped with her lover, Julius Caesar. History tells us that this matron, the mother of Brutus, was of the pure blood, one might use the modern expression blue blood, of the gens Servilia. For the sake of the colour, we cannot refrain from giving the description of a true collector of art as related in all its suggestive relativity in the Satyricon, the only known fiction of Roman times, a work which, though fiction, seems close to nature and a most faithful interpretation of the artistic merits and oddities of Roman life. I entered the Pinacotheca, where marvels of all kinds were gathered. There were works by Zeuxis which seemed to have triumphed over all the affronts of age, sketches by Protogenes that appeared to dispute merits with nature herself, works that I did not dare to touch but with a sort of religious fear. There were some monochromes by Apelles which moved me to holy reverence. What delicacy of touch and what precision of drawing in the figures! Ah, the painter of the very soul of things! Here, on the wings of an eagle, a god raising himself higher than the air. There, innocent Hylas repulsing a lascivious Naiad. Further on, Apollo cursing his murderous hands. At a certain moment the owner of the collection, apparently, arrives. He is of a type not yet extinct, the man who lives for his collection, the man so engrossed in his cherished objects as to forget and neglect other pleasures in life, social obligations, etc. A white-haired old man arrived, the author of the Satyricon goes on to relate. His tormented expression seems to herald grandeur. His garments were of that neglected character which is often distinctly of literary people who have not been spoilt by wealth. I thought of questioning him. He was more of a connoisseur than myself in the epochs of the paintings and their subjects, some of the latter incomprehensible to me. What is the reason, I asked him while we were speaking of painting, for the weakening, the great decadence of the fine arts nowadays? More especially of painting which seems to have disappeared and to have left no trace of past glory. He answered, the passion for money, that is the cause of the great change. Years ago, when merit, though left to starve, was glorified and appreciated, art flourished. Then, only to mention sculpture, Lysippus was perishing of hunger at the feet of the very statue he was intent upon perfecting. Myron, that marvellous artist who could cast in bronze the life of men and animals, Myron was so poor that at his death no one was to be found to accept his inheritance. We of our time, given over to orgies, wine and women, have no energy left to study the fine pieces of art under our very eyes. We prefer to abuse and slander antiquity. Only vice nowadays finds great masters and pupils. Do you believe that in our day any go to the temple to pray for the health of their body? Before all else, even before reaching the threshold of the temple, the one will promise an offering to the gods if his rich relation dies and makes him his heir, the other if he discovers a treasure, and another if he shall achieve the dispersal of his 3rd million in health and safety. And are you surprised that painting languishes when in the eyes of every man an ingot of gold is a masterpiece that cannot be equalled by anything that Apelles, Phidias and all the crack-brained Greeks have been able to produce? With the growth of fashion, a collection of art became the necessary complement of a wealthy mansion. The need then arose to give this collection the noblest place in the palace, a room apart to enhance its importance. This new view brought about a new architectural distribution of the Roman patrician mansion, not only on account of the family life and obligations of a wealthy class of citizens, but because the well-to-do Roman had obligations towards art and antiquity. In the Roman mansion we thus find first the atrium, a large hall open to friends, clients and visitors at large. The peristyle is the second courtyard and is reserved for the family. In the atrium the domestic gods were generally placed and records concerning the family, including genealogical trees, stemmata. With time these atria became regular museums, as they were excellent places for decoration and the display of art, being the open central part of the house girded by a colonnade. An idea of the importance of these atria may be gathered from that of Scaurus' palace, which had 38 columns 12½ yards high, made of the same kinds of rare marble that faced the walls, Egyptian green, old yellow or oriental alabaster, African marble and other rare kinds brought from Syria and Numidia. Scaurus' atrium appears to have been hung round with tapestries, embroidered with gold, illustrating mythological scenes. Alternating with these rare tapestries were panopliae and family portraits. Though perhaps the favourite spot, the atrium was not the only place for the artistic display of the Romans. Their palaces also contained aesai, magnificent galleries used for receptions, and the exedri, which were rooms for conversation, generally of a more sober decoration. In the triclinia there were kept works in precious metals and the finest pieces of furniture. There was also the sacrarium, a private shrine where precious pieces of art were often hidden. Verres found his famous kaneiporos, basket bearers, by Polykleitus, the Cupid of Praxiteles, and the Hercules of Myron in the sacrarium of Heges of Messina. There was also a room in Roman mansions set apart for the library, and some had special nooks for such collections as gems and cameos. The place where the best paintings were shown was called the Pinacotheca, and was always built towards the north so that the light from the windows should be without much variation, and above all because the northern exposure left no chance for the sun's rays to enter and spoil the effect of the painting. The Roman collector of books very often went in for elegant bindings and all the showy and decorative side of a library. Seneca deplores the fact that while every elegant house in Rome contained a library, many of these collections of books were simply for show. Too many collectors, not dissimilar in this from our bibliomaniacs of today, had quantities of works they did not care to read. "What is the use of having so many thousand volumes?" cries Seneca. The lifetime of their owners would hardly suffice to read the titles of the works. There is a man with scarcely the literary knowledge of a serf, and he is buying volumes not to read them, but as an ornament for his dining room. There is another who is proud of his library only because it is in cedar and ivory. He has the mania of buying books that no one looks for. He is always gaping among his volumes which he has bought solely for their titles. Lazy people who never read are likely to be found with complete collections of the works of orators or historians, books upon books. One could really forgive this mania if it had originated in a real passion for reading, but all these fine works, the great creations of divine genius, works ornamented with the portraits of their authors, do but serve to decorate the walls. Tranquillity, chapter 9. A large library was the desire of Horace. He wrote to Lelius, "Do you know my daily prayer? Great gods, let me keep the little I own, less if it is your pleasure. Let me live according to my choice the days your indulgence has granted me. Let me have plenty of books, 1 year's income in advance that I may not be obliged to live day by day from hand to mouth. As regards the peace of my heart and my happiness, that is my affair." Satires, Book 2, Chapter 6. Such contrarieties have a genuine echo in our society where the bibliomaniac is rarely a literary man or even slightly interested in literature. Bibliomaniacs collected volumes for the most part either because some of them were considered rare and therefore advertised the high price paid for them, or because they might serve as a decorative show, but the collecting of general art and curios, with a few exceptions, appears to have been vacuous and freakish. Even specialization, which is held to be progress in modern times, but as a matter of fact more often merely represents the triumph of erudition over art and taste, exercised in Rome the momentary tyranny of fashion. An example of this specialization is given us by the craze in Rome for Corinthian bronze. Without entering into a discussion about the legends of its origins and simply hinting that there are strong proofs that the alloy existed long before the siege of Corinth, we are safe in saying that the craze in Rome for Corinthian bronze was one of those freaks of fashion that has had, perhaps, no echo in all the after history of collectomania. Every amateur was at that time bound to have at least one vase of the coveted metal. According to Pliny, Book 34, chapters 1, 2 and 3, in his time this metal was equal to gold in value. In order to obtain 2 vases of this precious metal, Mark Antony ordered the assassination of the owner, and it must be borne in mind that Mark Antony was accused of using golden vessels for the lowest services of his household. Octavianus, supposed to be a collector of mild passions and a man who certainly did give up all such hobbies on becoming emperor, was also very fond of the fashionable metal Corinthiorum praecupitus, and did not scruple to adopt the methods of Sulla and Mark Antony to gratify his ultra fashionable taste. Times were then ripe for all forms of degeneration. Connoisseurs like those of today began to discuss patina. As it required years for Corinthian bronze to assume the proper patina, nobilis aerugo, Horace calls it, it was natural that this alloy should have the preference over all other kinds of bronze. But there were gradations of colour even in this metal and value was discriminated according to the quality of the patina. Of these patinae, the Roman collector recognized 5 different kinds. Apart from these varying degrees of merit, the connoisseur, Pliny tells us, could tell the quality of the alloy from its weight and determine the excellency of the patina by its smell. Another craze in Rome that greatly fostered imitation and forgery was that of murrhines, cups of a mysterious material which was more valued than any other rare stone or rock crystal, though a cup of the latter, according to Pliny, Book 37, easily fetched 150,000 sesterces, an amount equivalent to £1,200. As a rule, according to Pliny, for one of these cups a bigger price was paid than for a slave. If the Romans, unlike the Americans, had no detectives at festivals and banquets, they certainly took precautions to guarantee the safety of the treasures displayed and to guard against the possible greed of some guest. Whereas Virro drinks from pateras of beryl, remarks Juvenal, speaking to a parasite, no one would trust you with even a simple golden cup, or if perchance they do let you use one, be sure a guardian near you has previously counted the precious stones studding it, and follows with his eye the movement of your fingers and your sharp nails. One can really not refrain from giving this gorgeous patch of Roman colour as Juvenal himself puts it. Ipse capaces heliadum crustas et inequales beryllo viro tenet pielas, tibi non committitor aurum, vel si quando datur custos affixus ibidem, qui numeret gemmas unguesque observet acutos. Part 5, line 38. One may be sure that the man charged with watching was likely to do his duty with the utmost solicitude. Carelessness in handling those precious pieces that were used to decorate Roman tables was not easily overlooked. An anecdote will illustrate this. Vedius Pollio, a Roman nobleman, possessed one of the most esteemed collections of these crystals. One day when Augustus was dining at this favourite's house, a slave broke one of the precious crystal cups. Vedius immediately ordered the slave to be thrown alive into the pond of lampreys. Disgusted at such an order, Augustus not only made a freedman of the slave, but ordered that Vedius's whole collection of crystals should be broken before his eyes and thrown into the pond of lampreys. But as we have said above, the craze for murrhines surpassed the craze for the precious crystal, though comparing the two, we are bound to add, with no artistic justification. What these murrhines were made of is not exactly known. Some of the scholars of our day believe they were artificial, a mixture of clay with myrrh, hence perhaps the name. Winckelmann is inclined to think they were made of a kind of agate, and Marryat and De Caylus respectively believe them to have been mother of pearl, or fluorspar, or porcelain. In further illustration of the peculiar substance of the murrhines we quote from Pliny. The material of the murrhines is in blocks no larger than an ordinary glass, and a stratum no thicker than the marble of a small console. There is no real splendour in this material, but instead of splendour what one might call brilliancy. What gives the murrhines their price is the variety of their tints, the colour of the veining, either purple or pure white, sometimes shading off into nuances, reaching in some species the hue of blazing purple. The white samples shade into roseate or milky tones. Some amateurs are fond of freakish accidentalities or reflex iridescent changes like the rainbow, others prefer opaque effects. Transparency and pale hues are considered defects, as also opaque grains inside even if they do not alter the surface like tumours spreading in the human body. The quality of the odour helps to set the price on the stuff. Book 37, Chapter 8. It is to be noted that while this rather vague description of Pliny's would seem on the one hand to point to the agate or any fluorspar, the addition of the odour tends to destroy this hypothesis. In any case, murrhines became the rage of the Roman collector, and the fashion being, as usual, imperative, no one was considered elegant or correct who did not own at least one sample of the precious cups. One of these cups, which, according to Pliny's estimate, could not contain more than a measure of liquid, less than half a gallon, had cost the large sum of 70 talents, £15,400. Adding that the cup had belonged to a consul and that the edge of it was nibbled, Pliny remarks that such damage is the reason of the increased price. There is not in all Rome a murrhine which can boast of a more illustrious origin. Book 37, Chapter 7. This consul, who loved his cup so much as to nibble it on putting it to his lips, this collector, whose name is unknown to us, used up all his patrimony on his hobby of collecting murrhines. He possessed so many of them, Pliny adds, that one might have filled with them the private theatre that Nero had constructed in his gardens on the other bank of the Tiber. Perhaps one of the most esteemed murrhines was that which was considered the gem of Petronius's collection. He had paid 300 talents, £66,000 for it. Knowing how much Nero coveted this precious cup, and wishing to baffle his plans, before destroying himself, Petronius ordered his slaves to break it to pieces, so that it should not fall into the hands of the man he detested. A rival craze in Rome to that of murrhines was the passion for tables of citrus. Here, too, there is uncertainty as to the nature of this rare wood called citrus. Apparently it grew at the foot of Mount Atlas in Africa, and was in all probability a thuja. To obtain the proper grain it was felled at the root and cut into planks of a length to furnish the board of the table. Pliny seems to think that Cicero, the snob collector, set the example of extravagance in these tables. The one he bought at the fancy price of 4,000 English sovereigns was still in existence in Pliny's time and went under the name of the Ciceroniana. Cicero's price, however, was surpassed by Asinius Gallus and Cethegus, the former paying 1.1 million sesterces for his citrus table and the latter 1.4 million sesterces. Yet according to Cicero, the citrus table that Verres had placed in his triclinium was the finest and most valuable Rome had ever seen. Needless to add that in this article too collectors had their preferences, that there was citrus and citrus, that the precious tables were valued according to the grain of the wood and the patina. There were four qualities among the most appreciated. The tigrines, the pantherines and the pavonines were those tables of which the grain and knots of the woods resembled the coats of the two animals in the case of the two first, whereas the wood of the last showed knots like the eyes of a peacock's tail. The fourth quality was called apiates, for in these tables the wood looked like a mass of dark seeds, or more accurately a swarm of bees, hence the name. The collectomania and thirst for display must have not only favoured the trade in spurious pieces of cheap imitation, but have caused in the chaos of tastes at times an equal confusion in general reasoning. Thus wise men and philosophers appear to have indulged in, what shall we say, rather amateurish considerations, indicating the reasoning powers of a dilettante. Cicero at one time jibes at collectors and at another boasts of being a collector himself. Seneca, the wise Seneca, the cool-headed philosopher, was no better. Forgetting that his triclinium was adorned with 500 fine, tripod-like tables with ivory feet, he writes as a comment, "I like a simple table with nothing remarkable about its grain, one that is not celebrated in the city for having belonged to a succession of lovers of fashion." And then, material considerations to which a pure soul mindful of its origins should give no weight. At one time fashion demanded that citrus should be used in veneering, an art in which the Romans were extremely skilful, using all kinds of rare woods, ivory and tortoiseshell. Furniture veneered with tortoiseshell, especially, fetched an extremely high price, and was in considerable vogue for a time. The fact was sufficient to prompt Seneca to this odd comment: "Is it possible that people are so ready to pay most extravagant prices for the shell of such an unclean and lazy animal? The prices paid for art were only too often created by fashion, as shown by the artistic milieu of Rome we have been trying to outline. And yet the characters we have passed in review in our reconstruction of the past do not seem altogether dissimilar from some of our present day lovers of art." End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 5. Increase of Faking in Rome. Increase of faking. Imitation precious stones. Cameos. Restorers and copyists. It is evident that in a society like that of Rome, and an artistic milieu such as we have tried to depict, comprising a few good collectors among a whole horde of fools setting up as full-fledged connoisseurs, deception and fakery must have been rampant. The large profits promised by a trade in sham art must have helped to perfect those enslaved Greeks in methods of taking an artistic revenge upon their oppressors. Romans, especially in art matters, must have seemed to them mere parvenus. The practised eclectic qualities and adaptability of those Graeculi delirantes, crazy paltry Greeks, so active in Rome, must have helped matters. In time there was nothing they could not produce for the benefit of their patrons, and often to such perfection as to deceive even keen-eyed connoisseurs. As a consequence, already in Rome the imitation of art and curios produced a certain perplexed feeling even among people who claimed to be acquainted with the business of buying art and antiques. Pliny, who was somewhat of a connoisseur, more especially in bronzes, writes to a friend that he has bought a charming statuette of Corinthian bronze. and in confessing that he likes it, no matter whether modern or antique, seems to reveal the cautious attitude of a man who does not wish to be caught in error, a fear and uncertainty that very able forgers had created in Rome. Beyond a few hints and jibes about certain collectors and art lovers and a few comments of Pliny and others, we have no detailed account of the part that imitation and faking played in Rome, but it is to be presumed that the latter especially found numerous and ever ready clients, and that it was able and prosperous beyond the dreams of modern art duping. According to Pliny, the favourite article, the one to which fakers and forgers gave their utmost care and attention, was the article that was in vogue at the moment and therefore promised the biggest return. Thus murrhines did not escape this fate, they were imitated with obsidian. Pliny also adds that all kinds of precious stones were imitated in Rome, not only by coloured glass but also by a selection of stones that though rare were of less value comparatively than the types they imitated. The most esteemed kinds of sardonyx were counterfeited by joining various pieces of the cheaper jaspers or onyx, cleverly alternating red, white and black, and joining the pieces in such a manner that it was most difficult, Pliny tells us, for a connoisseur to detect a fraud. The same writer, who gives valuable hints on the imitation of precious stones, says that in his time there were even books from which one could learn the art of counterfeiting precious stones, that all of them could be imitated, topaz, lapis lazuli and amethyst, that amber could be coloured, obsidian used to counterfeit hyacinths, sapphires, etc. Speaking of the sardonyx, more especially, Pliny says, no fraud brings so much money as this. In this line there were also other kinds of fraud. One of the most profitable was the imitation of precious stones with paste ones. There are some imitation cameos that are a puzzle even today. Commenting upon this fraud, Winckelmann benevolently points out that we owe to this unscrupulous commerce of false cameos the preservation of the casts of some precious originals now lost. The marvellous part of these imitation cameos is that the faker was not only able to imitate the plain stone of the original, but all its characteristic veining and peculiarities. With regard to bronzes and other metal works, it is to be presumed that not only could the Nobilis Aerugo of Horace be easily counterfeited, as it is today, but the work as well. Pliny the Younger gives us valuable hints about the perplexity that faking had generated among the connoisseurs of his time. The Greek artists in particular showed themselves most versatile, they reproduced in Rome the most esteemed originals, and could to a certain extent imitate the most appreciated types of art. Zenodorus, for example, copied for Germanicus a cup by Calamis in such perfect imitation of the chiselling that the copy could not be told from the original. Fraudulent masterpieces of painting and sculpture, often with the forged signature of some great artist, as at present times, were already on the market in Cicero's time. His Odi falsus inscriptiones statuarum alienarum is eloquent enough. Phaedrus seems to complete Cicero's information about Roman art faking. It is in this way, he says, speaking of faked paintings and sculpture, that some of our artists can realize better prices for their work. By carving the name of Praxiteles on a modern marble, the name of Scopas on a bronze statue, that of Myron on a silver piece, and by putting the signature of Zeuxis to a modern painting. We do not intend to confound fakers with honest restorers of works of art. But in Roman times, as is often the case in our own, faking learned no small lesson from the deft hand of the restorer. The same may be said for imitators and copyists, who even in ancient Rome followed their trade openly with no intention of cheating. Copyists in particular were very active and their work was certainly appreciated by a certain class of citizens. The fact is proved by the numerous copies of Greek masterpieces that have been unearthed in Rome and elsewhere. When an original was not to be had, a copy was often ordered. Lucullus sent an artist expressly to Athens to make a copy for him of a work by Pausias. the portrait of Glycera, the artist's lady love. Restorers of works of art were, in Rome as elsewhere, the nearest relatives of fakers. Their ability to imitate antiquity must have proved a great temptation, and the enormous sums paid for certain objects, and the gross ignorance of some of the buyers, must have paved the way to more than one passage from honesty to dishonesty. There were many restorers' workshops in Rome, and one has been discovered near the Forum, where apparently new limbs and heads were provided for damaged statues. Many an antique statue has come down to us already repaired. Evander Aulanius, says Pliny, Book 36, Chapter 5, restored the head of Diana in the temple of Apollo on the Palatine. Like modern restorers, their forefathers of Rome had not always the delicate hand needed for such operations. When the praetor Julius ordered the cleaning of the paintings in the temple of Apollo, it was done in such a rough manner that all the charm of the works disappeared, a fact that may have induced some good connoisseurs to advise leaving untouched the Venus Anadyomene of Apelles, the masterpiece placed by Caesar in the temple of that goddess, and to let it be damaged by age, rather than allow the sacrilegious hand of a restorer to maim the divine painting of the Greek artist. From what we have been perusing we may conclude that the Roman artistic world was not entirely different from the artistic world of today. Certainly the city must have been of a magnificence of which no conception is given by its grandiose ruins. But the artistic life and the narrow path of the collector were somewhat similar to those of today. Some of the characters we have quoted would seem to be alive today, a change of names and a milieu of more modern colouring and they would provide ground for an action of libel. We feel quite familiar, in fact, with the characters described by Seneca. Even today the world possesses collectors of rusty nails and other worthless objects, mere cult of fetishism. We feel no less acquainted with some of the other types to whom Martial pays his attention. The man who gathers ants fossilized in amber, the collector of relics who glories in owning a fragment of the Argonaut ship, might both be alive today. So might Licinius the demented, Codrus the penurious and dissatisfied, Eros the enthusiast and dreamer. They still exist and are well represented in their various shades of foolishness, down to that Mamurra who used to upset all the shops of the Roman antiquaries without buying a single thing. Would you resuscitate Tongilius to our modern society, just substitute a bright motor car for his rich and cumbersome lectica? And for a certainty the name of some modern collector of art, some up-to-date Maecenas, will come to your mind. Of course, though Mr. Cook had not yet alighted to relieve itinerant humanity from many troubles, tourists existed even at the time when Rome did not possess the modern type of traveller. According to Titus Livius, many foreigners used to visit the temples of Porta Capena, regular museums of art. The tourists of that time followed a routine, as we can gather from Pliny and other writers. They were taken to the Palatine, to the Via Sacra to admire the temples of Apollo with its peristyle of 52 columns, adorned by the simulacra of the Danaides and 50 equestrian statues, one of the finest sights in Rome and which inspired Horace with an ode. This temple of Lunny marble with ivory doors, surmounted by a quadriga in gilded bronze carrying the god, was also a museum, containing among other things a fine collection of gems and a room lined with silver in which the Sibylline books were kept. The Domus Aurea, the painting of Apelles exhibited in the Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Venus, one of the finest emporiums of art, that of Ceres which contained the celebrated Bacchus of Aristides of Thebes, the Martius of the Temple of Concord, and in the Capitol the Theseus of Zeuxis, in Pompey's portico the Soldier by Polygnotus, in the Temple of Peace the Hero of Timante, and another famous work by Protogenes. There were of course foolish tourists who, like today, insisted on being fed with more or less authentic anecdotes of relics of an impossible character, who believed the unbelievable. Thus, according to Procopius, who evidently believed the genuineness of the relic, many tourists went to see the boat still moored in the river from which the Aeneas had landed in Italy, etc. This kind of tourist must have inspired Lucian with the comment that Greek guides in Rome might have starved but for the nonsense and legends with which they enriched their descriptions of the city. But what of that, remarks Lucian. Visitors like to hear such things, and do not seem interested in the truth even if offered to them free of charge. The revival of the past needed this slight touch to show that the artistic world of 2000 years ago was not, after all, dissimilar to that of our enlightened days. Need we repeat that the phenomenon of art faking for the benefit of foolish lovers of art generally appears when the passion for collecting takes that Byzantine attitude which makes it ripe for decay and degeneration, when mania, fashion and snobbery chiefly hold the ground instead of taste and genuine love of art, in fact, when the parvenus or the lunatics submerge the intelligent collector. It follows consequently that the decline of collectomania heralds the decline of forgery. The latter, its errand over with the cessation of the demand for antiques and curios, disappears to await a fresh chance. But the fake festival and carnival will revive, phoenix-like, with the awakening of a new artistic world, just as though faking at certain moments answered to a sore need of society. End of chapter 5.